central point of every synagogue. There's a Torah scroll in there, and then there's a Talmud scroll. Talmud is rabbinic interpretation of the meanings of the Torah. And it's a growing thing. If you've ever seen a Talmud, you will look and there'll be the scripture that's being interpreted in the middle. Then rabbis have written their opinions all around in the margins, and the margins keep getting bigger.
I thought the Mishnah actually, Paul, was what continued more than the Talmud.
The Mishnah is part of the Talmud.
Okay.
And so that's how, so they're trying to figure out what God means by being just and so on. Because it's one thing to say, be just and compassionate. It's another thing to say how. Because if the 20th century, 21st century is a different context than the 4th century BC. You follow? Figuring out what's being just in the 4th century is a different problem than it is in the 21st century because of the complexity of human civilization as it now exists. And we've even expanded the notion of justice to non-human living things, even trees. Okay. So, but that's all commanded by God to do, and we have to figure that out. And the same with the Quran. The Quran is all about justice, and trying to figure out what that means. What does surrendering to God's will mean? And so you have different traditions of Islam trying to figure that out. Okay. And how do you relate justice to compassion? The same thing. They're supposed to be both there in the same way. And Christian tradition does the same thing. Now, when you get to a tradition like Hinduism, okay, that's a much older tradition than Christianity is. That goes back to the Indus Valley civilization, which was contemporary with Egyptian civilization. All those Egyptian Indian ideas start in the Indus Valley. And you have all these deities in Hindu tradition. They're limitless. They're called avatars. And you go into a Hindu temple, you'll see the eyes of the avatars, the deities, looking right at you. Okay. And you're supposed to look into those. It's called darshan, seeing, to see that sacred element called Brahman in you. Avatars are limited manifestations of Brahman, which means power. Okay. And so is everything else that exists. And if you practice darshan well enough through meditation, yoga, all those things, you might be able to apprehend the sacred as part of another human being. You can see that. And so the gods we worship is an expression of who we are at that time. They are limited, partial manifestations of one sacred power called Brahman. So that Krishna is a deity that preserves and protects. Okay, might be your favorite manifestation of Brahman. So you focus on Krishna, and you try to see the world through Krishna's eyes and your eyes, and apprehend that sacred power in other living things, and react accordingly. You follow? Do you see? No, yeah.
I just had a couple of comments on Hinduism. I always thought that at least those Hindus I know do not really take those gods literally.
No, they don't.
Aparata, it's almost a mythology. It's almost a guide on how to live and an explanation, as all religions are.
That's another way of saying it, yeah.
Okay, just trying to understand.
Think of the deities in Hinduism as pointers. They point to that reality, okay? They're
Right.
partial, limited pointers. And if you cling to a pointer, what do you have? The pointer, and you miss the reality it points to.
Uh-huh,
You follow?
got it.
Now that's the error. That's the error of all sorts of fundamentalism, and there are Hindu fundamentalists.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, just like there are Christian fundamentalists. But the text of Hinduism uh, will say that the universe is full of how can the universe not be expressions of Brahman? How cannot Brahman be incarnate in everything? And those incarnations of Brahman in everything are called avatars. Some look like deities. Ganesha, the elephant-headed deity.
Mhm.
Some looks like Vishnu, the preserver, or Krishna, the destroyer. And all the deities are dual natured. They're both male and female simultaneously. So you can go if your favorite deity is the female image of a god, focus on that, but get beyond it so you can experience what that points to. And there are different ways of doing that. There's yoga of different kinds, and so on and so on. Now, if you see or apprehend the sacred in all things, you behave differently. Okay? You have compassion for the suffering of all things, and you're motivated to do justice to relieve people and non-human life forms from suffering. Okay? That was what Gandhi tried to do. Gandhi was a Hindu, okay? And look what he did. He got the British out of India with nonviolence. Come on, you follow? Because even the British oppressors, they too are expressions of Brahman and need to be treated with respect accordingly. And so you don't fight them, you don't injure them, you teach them. and it worked. Okay? And Martin Luther King knew Gandhi, and some of what Gandhi did influenced Martin Luther King's civil rights actions here. Martin Luther King was the most nonviolent Christian I've ever seen. Okay, so Hinduism talks about a plurality of deities, but they're all expressions of one sacred power called Brahman. Now, that's a different notion of God than you have in Christianity, Judaism, Islam. But note, the connection between beings is supposed to be based on justice and compassion. And that's how you create community. That's always the ideal. Okay? Okay. Now, if you're a Buddhist, what happens? Buddhism grew out of Hinduism. Okay? The Buddha himself lived around 4th century BC. Okay, and Siddhartha was actual human being. We don't know much about him, his biography, but it's an actual human being who lived a fairly rich life. His father was a Raja, and he was in part of the political system and so on, but he never was satisfied with what was going on. And so he undertook, before most Hindus do, he entered the forest hermit state of life. He became a wanderer and associated with different teachers and practiced different kinds of religious disciplines. And one day he sat under a tree, and all of a sudden, wham, he experienced something that Buddhists call awakening or nirvana. And that made him into a Buddha, an awakened one, but not a deity. Buddhists don't pay much attention to deities. Okay, they don't deny their existence, but that's not the problem. The problem is your suffering and how you cause your suffering by clinging to permanent existence in an impermanent world. Okay, the more you cling to that, the less you're able to live in harmony with the realities of the world. You can't see it as it is. You can't act with compassionate justice. Okay, so it requires meditation. It requires breaking your attachment to things that you think are permanent. Okay, and experiencing reality as it is, so you can act in accordance with reality as it is. Okay, it doesn't mean you can't love your wife, but you can't cling to it. The more you cling to love, it ceases to be love. You follow? So,
Yeah,
the Buddhists focus on meditation, and then on the basis of that, they try to get socially engaged. And there's a Buddhist movement called socially engaged Buddhism that arose, oh gosh, in the 60s. It goes back to Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Vietnamese Buddhist monk during the Vietnam War. So questions about this?
well, I have one question about it, which is mystic Christianity, I think, and Buddhism, this is more of a statement, have a lot in common because of the fact that, at least as I understand it, there's a rejection of reality. Reality meaning the physical world.
It's not a rejection. It's
Okay.
never a rejection. It's the goal of seeing it,
Yes.
comprehending it
Yep.
The way it is.
Because I was
so you can act in accordance with the way it is.
okay. Because I always thought that in Buddhism, the concept of Maya or illusion, as I recall, means that basically we get sucked into a illusion of the real world. We can't necessarily perceive the real world. Okay, I don't want to dwell on it, but I probably
Maya,
perfect.
that's a good question. Maya means delusion.
Yes,
Okay, not illusion, delusion. And
delusion.
in the Hindu tradition, delusion means not seeing Brahman as Brahman is, and reducing Brahma to individual gods, or
Okay.
ignoring the suffering of other people, or holding on to something that's permanent that's not. That's Maya. That's a delusion. Finding your comfort in that. Finding my comfort in free market capitalism is Maya, is delusion. Okay?
Mhm.
And for Buddhism, clinging to a permanent self, a soul. There's no such thing as a soul in Buddhism. Clinging to that is a delusion because it causes suffering. Because there's nothing there to cling to. Okay. Okay. So Buddhism takes the radical approach of doing the meditational thing. Hi, David. Hi, David, and so on. And awakening doesn't mean going to a paradise. It just means waking up to the way things are. And Buddhism doesn't. Early Buddhism didn't deal much with the question of what happens after I'm dead, when I'm awakened. That's if you're awakened, those problems resolve, and you don't have to worry about them. That's the standard Buddhist idea. Okay, which doesn't mean there aren't Buddhists who cling to a soul or a self and so on. I've met some fundamentalist Buddhists who are pretty strange.
So Paul, would you say that Buddhism does not believe in any kind of eternal life in contrast to Christianity?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say they just don't deal with the question.
Well,
Now, there are some forms of Buddhism that talk about reincarnation, that that's also from Hinduism, that you experience multiple lifetimes, and the kind of lifetime you experience is a result of all the karma you're carrying around with you. So maybe you come back in your next life as a dung beetle, who knows? Okay, but you keep recycling until you finally focus on what's real and try to live in harmony with what's real, and then whatever happens in the next life takes care of itself. That's the basic Buddhist idea.
Talk about what,
If I believed I was going to come back as a dung beetle, I might not want to believe in eternal life either.
Well, I've had friends tell me if I don't stop my behavior, I'm coming back as a dung beetle, but you know, it's probably true. Just don't step on me, okay?
So in Buddhism, if these were Buddhist friends, they allow you to judge one another then.
No, they're not as judgmental as the Christians. But there are some forms of Buddhism now that claim to be the only true religion, and they're generally associated with a tradition of Buddhism called Nichiren Buddhism, which focuses on a sutra, a discourse called the Lotus Sutra. Sutras are collected sayings of the Buddha, and they function as a kind of scriptural foundation, but it's a huge canon of scripture. Okay. In Hinduism, there's a huge canon of scripture as well. And so and it's all open to interpretation. The Bhagavad Gita, you've heard of that, is not scripture, it's tradition. It's the most popular religious text in Hinduism. I think it's a great text myself. Anyway, so these people will tell you that there's only one way to seek release from this world, and you have to chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo in Japanese, and which means I take refuge in the Lotus Sutra over and over again, and do that and live with compassionate justice. You're released from samsaric suffering, and so it's the only way to do it. And they go door to door and try to sell it like fundamentalists do. Now, last time I was in Japan, I was at we went to a meeting of a Nichiren sect of Buddhism, okay? And there were, the group of scholars and I were sitting there, and they had the temple was arranged much like a Christian church. You had an altar, you had a place for a preacher. The preacher wore black robes, with a stole. They sat in neat rows, Japanese style, with an aisle down the middle, and we sat in chairs toward the back. And the children's choir came in singing, chanting a sutra, okay, and sat down. And they read text, and they preached and so on. And then the pastor, you know how in Christian churches people come up and do confession and why they became a Christian and tell their story, and this woman stood up. Testimony. And this woman stood up when she was asked to do it, and she told about how her life before her, and this is all in Japanese, so I'm picking up about 65% of it, so trust me. So she said that before she became a member of this tradition, she was a prostitute, and she earned her money supporting her children doing that, and she was abused by men and all of that stuff, and she suffered and was in poverty, and she was in tears. But when she became a member of this sect, she stopped being a prostitute. She saw something she could hold on to. She's no longer poor, and she told how this group had really saved her. And she used the word saved, which is unusual in a Buddhist text. And then after the pastor got up and started saying, yeah, this woman was terrible. She was awful. And she didn't ever, and she wasn't any good for anything until she became a member of our group. So I'm sitting next to my friend, Mark Uno, who teaches at the University of Oregon. And he's a Pure Land Buddhist. And his father was one of the most important Buddhist scholars in the world, okay? And I said, Mark, am I hearing this right? And he said to me, yeah, shut up. Because, so after it was over, we go back and we're having a reception, and Mark goes up to this pastor and dresses him down for his misrepresentation of Buddhism as, and how it treated this woman. Oh, he went after him. And you don't see Japanese Buddhists doing that very often. But Mark wouldn't have it. Okay. So there are things there are nuances and different things going on, just like in any tradition. But it's all a takeoff from this fundamental of idea as you've got to sit and meditate, achieve awakening. Okay? And on the basis of that, you engage in social justice and compassion and build community. Okay? Now, Buddhism was the earliest monastic movement, and for them, community looked like celibate monasteries, just like Christianity's earliest communities were monastic communities. And the more that the non-monastic community could look like a monastic community, the more Christian it was. And that's what the church was teaching. Follow? Okay. Yeah, Gil.
Well, I was just going to go back to Hinduism for a moment. Having spent a reasonable amount of time in India and having worked with a lot of people who were of the Brahmin caste, the higher caste, if you will, in the caste system, I'm wondering, most faiths, including Hinduism, do believe in justice and compassion. However, by the same token, the belief in reincarnation allows many Hindus, at least Hindus that I knew, to believe that those people who are under them in caste can
That's right.
suffer because they have done something in their prior lives and there's nothing you can do about it. So therefore, there goes compassion out the window in many cases, not all.
That's right. But now Gandhi wanted to get rid of the caste system.
Yes, I understand that, but it hasn't really worked very well.
No, but it's getting better and better. But there are those conservative people who uphold the caste system and won't have it any other way. That's absolutely true. The caste system is very unjust from
Yes.
from our perspective. It's also unjust from Gandhi's perspective that everyone's an incarnation of Brahman and needs to be treated accordingly.
Correct.
If you do that, there's no caste.
I'm agreeing with that. I'm just pointing out that while all faiths do emphasize living justly and treating others fairly with equity, there are challenges in all faiths. And I was using Hinduism as one example.
Yeah. No, that's
yeah.
We're not arguing. I'm just trying to help you.
No, I understand. Fine,
Yeah.
thank you.
I was just gonna say, when we were at the mosque the other day, Riaz Khan was talking about somebody was talking about his mother, that his mother actually had the idea for a mosque in Mukilteo and so forth. Well, a few years back, his mother became very ill, and Riaz dropped everything he was doing and went to India and was there for a long period of time. I'd say probably 4 or 5 months.
Yeah.
And to work with his family. And while he was there, he said, I had time on my hands, so I put in a water system to a village. And apparently this village had no running water. And he being an engineer, worked it out and got whatever they needed to do and put in this water system. And he said before he left, they had one of these great big celebrations that they have and honored him for putting in this water system. But, this business of shared community and this is very much a part of these religions, very much.
But this community was probably where they were because of the caste system.
Yeah.
And Riaz wouldn't, as a Muslim, wouldn't have anything to do with that. Muslims in India were anti-caste.
And of course, he's a Pakistani Muslim, and the family was in India, now India.
Yeah.
How do you
Okay.
these, we're talking about everything from Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism. these different ways that their faiths are practiced, and how then sometimes you have these opposites, like one views the other on how they practice that faith. How does that correspond over, do you feel, to Christianity? I mean, we do have extremes on both ends of Christianity as well. I mean, I've been privy, unfortunately, to the conversation of, well, do you speak in tongues? Well, if you don't, then you're not a Christian. I mean,
Of
so
course.
I mean, we, in a way, I would say, even have it within our own fold of perception within the Christian faith. And yet, as you say, all faiths have this inner working of justice and mercy, compassion, looking and caring for your neighbor. At the same time, judgment.
Well, if you follow the Jesus way, okay, you can't live like everybody else. Okay. And that's what Christian tradition is about. Now, that doesn't mean all Christians, including us, follow the Jesus way. Okay. But you can think of some who do. I think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Okay. And that cost him his life. Okay.
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King, it cost him his life. Okay. Now, following the Jesus way doesn't mean it's going to cost you your life, but it can, because you can't live like everybody else, and that can make people upset. Okay. If you're a Buddhist, you can't live like everybody else, and that can get you oppressed. Okay. By people who are, well, by Muslims in India, for example. Muslims didn't take well to non-Muslims. They were objects of conversion. And when it didn't happen, they kind of isolated them. There's a religion called Sikhism that sought to start out as a non-violent sect, which tried to mix together principles of Hinduism, non-violence, with Islamic notions of justice. Okay. And the Hindus didn't like them because they compromised Hinduism by incorporating Islam into it. And the Muslims didn't like it because they didn't go far enough as Muslims. So both sides began to oppress them. Okay. And by the time of the sixth leader, the Guru, Nanak, Sikh men began to carry knives to defend themselves. And they do to this day.
Yep.
You don't cut your hair, but a Sikh man will have a little tiny knife in his lapel or somewhere as a kind of badge, And the Sikhs are really one of the most nonviolent traditions you can find. And boy, do they know how to party.
They're also the primary military caste in India,
That's right.
ironically.
That's right. Yeah, they kind of they're in the, most of them, a lot of men are in the army, the Indian
Yes.
army, and
Yes.
the police.
Gurkhas.
And they're also bodyguards of Indira. The bodyguards of Indira Gandhi, for instance, when she was assassinated by them. I don't mean that pejoratively, it may have been earned, but the point is that they have a very specialized place in Indian culture.
Oh, they do. They really do.
So can I ask a question about what I perceive to be a difference? And some of it relates to what Pastor Pam was saying. But as I read the chapter, and I guess I read it in many places that justice and compassion, which is common among all, is something in the non-Christian religions that you are expected to do in order to earn karma, to earn favor, to find nirvana, all of those things. And I do think that Christianity now, and it'll vary between sects of Christianity, but that our take on grace is pretty different, that I don't do justice and compassion. And I guess I would say it's some of the difference by if you take the Micah text all by itself versus combining it with the New Testament. I don't take compassion and justice as something I have to do to earn God's favor, because I also know that I can't do justice and compassion under my own power, but that it
Yeah.
is in a response to God's first love. And so I'm not doing it to earn favor. I'm doing it in response to God's favor, which seems to me a different take on
Well-
justice and compassion than some of these others.
Let me give you a surprise. Okay, there is a school of Buddhism that originated in Japan called Jodo Shinshu, True Pure Land Buddhism, and it focuses on what's called a bodhisattva.
Mhm.
Bodhisattvas are people who strive for awakening and get it, but then stay behind to help us achieve it. Now, that's part of the larger tradition of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism, Great Vehicle Buddhism. South Asian Buddhism is called Theravada Buddhism. That's the oldest form of Buddhism. Okay, now, so the story goes that there was a person who struggled for enlightenment and got it, but renounced it until he could be available to help all living things achieve awakening. And he became a bodhisattva named Amida Buddha, okay, who has a Buddha land called the Pure Land, okay, and in the Pure Land he tries to help all living things achieve what he achieved, and it's all by grace. You can't do it by yourself. It's awakening by faith through grace alone. This is the largest sect of Buddhism in the world. Okay, so you have something that's similar. Now, Amida Buddha isn't God. He's a bodhisattva who's going to help us achieve awakening. But you can see the parallel emphasis upon faith through grace. Faith means trust in Amida Buddha. Faith in Christianity means trust in God's efforts to help us, okay, as modeled by the historical Jesus. Faith in Pure Land Buddhism is trust in Amida Buddha as modeled by the stories of Amida's lifetime.
Mm.
Okay.
So does this grace in any way, shape, or form involve being chosen by the Amida Buddha?
No, because
Not at
we're
all,
all
but-
chosen.
Okay.
We're all chosen.
Right.
We're all objects of this compassion. Now, if you really believe this, and I know Buddhists who do, your life is one of compassion, as an expression of the compassion given you. Now, here's a hiccup. I have a Buddhist friend named Sally King, who is a great Buddhist scholar, and she does a lot of work in Buddhist feminism and all of this stuff. And she argues that Buddhism has so stressed compassion, it has a hard time thinking about justice, because sometimes justice means you have to do some harm. And compassion for Buddhism, you do no harm. So how do you get justice into the equation? Okay, and this has been.
I think that's a really good question, Paul. And I think the first thing that comes to mind in some of the reading, and Pam talked about it in her sermon today, there are many that say the only answer to white supremacy is for white people to give up some of their supremacy. And in a sense, that could be seen as doing harm. Somebody has to give up something in order for someone else to get it. And that may be part of justice.
Jesus gave up his life. That's
yeah.
Okay.
Well, and that just goes
Okay.
back to the golden rule. And I know that Hinduism, because I did this as a youth uh, retreat one year on a 30-hour famine, is we took all of the major religions, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, all that, and they all have a form of the golden rule. They all, Muslim, all do about loving your neighbor. And so that in itself is both, I think, compassion, mercy, and justice. Because to love your neighbor, like you said, Co, sometimes that means we have to take a step back. We have to give something up as a form of love. And maybe even that giving up is a mask, right? Giving up our our civil rights, as some would say, to love our neighbor.
Let me say something about Sally King. She's a Quaker and a Zen Buddhist. She has a double religious identity. And a lot of people have dual religious identities. I have friends who are Roman Catholic, Jesuits, and Buddhists
Like
of
Martin.
some different school, and they mix them together in some way. And they're very good scholars.
Paul has been called a Lubu.
I've been called a Lubu, Lutheran Buddhist, by my Buddhist friend who lives in, down at the University of Oregon. His dad and I became friends. And then Mark, when he started teaching, became a friend. And I count those two guys as some of the best friends I've ever had. They taught me more about who I am as a Christian
Dialogue partners.
as in dialogue than I've ever learned anywhere else. But anyway, Sally King is a practicing Buddhist who raises this question, and Buddhists are now liberal Buddhists of different sectarian persuasion are now in the process of trying to figure out what's going on here. Because if justice means doing injury for a just cause, what do we do? Well, that's a tough question. It's a tough question for Christians. Do
And there are Buddhists right now in Myanmar who are hurting and killing different people, the Rohingyas and others.
So that's the most anti-Buddhist stuff I've ever seen.
Yes, and some of them.
And you've got Hindus, Buddhists, and Christians all involved in that.
Mhm,
And it
yes.
goes against all of what they say they stand for. I mean, look at the Crusades. That was against as well. So often we do twist scriptures of whatever faith it is to spread our good news, but is that justice? Is that compassion? Is it doing harm?
Now you're seeing the same questions in all these traditions,
Mhm.
every one of them. Now, let me turn to the Chinese tradition for a minute, okay? That's a very complicated tradition, and it's very old, okay? But what's called Taoism and Confucianism are really not separate traditions in the lives of Chinese people, okay? But if you're a Taoist, you always look for the middle way between extremes. That's called Wu Wei. So you can live by actionless action, act in accordance with the way things are without regard to getting anything out of it. Because the moment you do, you distort what you're doing, okay? So if you're by actionless action, you see things as they are, respond to them in a natural way, and that creates justice and compassion. Now that's a fairly simple way of saying that. Confucianists was a little bit more. They wanted to institutionalize that. All things should reflect the Tao, the way. The universe is a system of natural forces always seeking balance between extremes. And you should do the same thing by living in harmony with that way, the Tao. The word Tao means way. And so there's a Taoist way of doing that. And these guys went into the hills, made monasteries, practiced meditations, did Tai Chi, Kung Fu, all of that stuff as a way of dancing in harmony with things. If you ever study a Chinese martial art, there's always a masculine and a feminine movement. Okay. And if you speed them up, it's a very powerful way of defending yourself. And trust me. Okay. But now if you're a Confucian scholar, you're talking about trying to systematize how this works. So you live in harmony by the Tao by being filial to your parents, taking care of them. You think in terms of natural orders of hierarchies. Older people are generally superior to younger people, and so on and so on. And you find your spot in the system and respond to that naturally. And that's basically a Confucian way of thinking about it. Okay. And it's all a way of trying to experience what this Tao is, this reality is, by trying to find that point of balance in our social lives. I have responsibility to my wife that I have because I'm a husband, and not doing that is not very nice. She has responsibility as my wife as well. I have responsibilities to my pastor. She has responsibilities to us. I have responsibility to my friends I'm looking at on the screen, and vice versa. And it's always finding out where we are in the social system and responding in appropriate ways. And that's usually living in balanced harmony with the Tao. So this is a social expression of what Taoists try to do in their temple as they do Kung Fu and Tai Chi and so on. Okay? Okay. Now, and so what's just emerges out of this naturally. What's compassionate emerges out of this naturally because it's always at that point of balance that you find justice and compassion working. Too much justice is a tyranny. Too much compassion is mere sentimentality. They need to be balanced. That's the Chinese way. Follow? I'm going to shut up now.
A little bit like justice is blind.
A little bit.
I have a hard time with that concept that too much compassion is sentimentality, because I think sentimentality and compassion are different. And I think that honestly, how can you have too much compassion? That's like having too much love. I mean, if it's too much love, at some point it's probably not love. It's probably suffocation or possession or something weird, but it's not love itself.
But see, love always expresses itself in just ways. That's the point. Compassion always expresses itself in just ways.
Mm-hmm.
But there are folks who ignore social responsibility. They go with their feelings, and they go with their feelings to such an extreme that they're compassionate and nice people, but they're irrelevant. Okay, they don't help. They don't work in society in a balanced way. So that's a common thread, though. You get at it differently in all the world's religions, but it's a common thread. It's something you have to find, and finding it is synonymous with behaving in accordance with what you find. If you can't find justice without being just. You can't find compassion without being compassionate. And you can't be compassionate out of harmony with justice. It just doesn't work that way. And that's true of all the religions we've talked about.
Pam was
In
gonna say
different
something.
ways, talking about it in different ways, of course.
Pam.
Pastor Pam.
I saw Gil's hand up.
That's okay. I think Paul answered what I was thinking.
So moving from that, Paul, this idea that we do have multiple faiths, all have a call for justice and compassion, all fail at it to one level or another. We're all creatures of the creator and all fallen, whatever framework you want to word that. What do you see, and maybe jumping us to the next chapter too soon, but what do you see as a needed interfaith dialogue to bring us accountable to not
Well,
too much justice and not too much compassion, as you said, but truly
Yeah.
being in harmony?
well, I think I've been thinking about interfaith dialogue my entire professional life, of course. It's a practice of trying, when you're in dialogue with somebody, okay, you have to leave aside your assumptions for a time. Doesn't mean give them up, it means leave them aside. Don't let them operate in your head as much as possible. And that's impossible totally, but at least as much as possible when you're in a conversation with a person in another faith. And you hope that person does the same thing. And you focus on usually something you need to talk about. No, it might be God. It might be what you mean by justice. It might be what you mean by monastic life. It could be anything. And you hear what that person has to say, okay, and you appropriate what you can, okay, that makes sense to you, and your own faith gets transformed. You don't necessarily become a Buddhist, but you become, there are principles of Buddhism that you can incorporate into your own Christian faith.
Right.
That's why people call me a Lubu. Now, there's not everything in Buddhism that I can incorporate in my faith. Any kind of fundamentalism, I just throw out the window. But there's wisdom out there we need to learn. Okay, there are some pretty wise Hindus. Mahatma Gandhi was, we need to learn from that guy. And you don't have to be a Hindu. Now, Mahatma Gandhi, as a Hindu, thought all religions were about the same deity. Okay, and that's something that can be argued. But he believed that God expresses himself in all the religions of the world, and you approach God from where you're born. Chances are, if you had been born in South Asia, you'd be a Buddhist. Chances are, if you had been born in Saudi Arabia, you'd be a Muslim. But it's not determined, but chances are. And doesn't mean people keep their religious identity all their lives. Identity is a very fluid thing. You're not the same Christian today, are you, that you were when you were teenagers? Okay, you've gone through stuff, and that influences what you see. Well, part of the stuff you can go through is talking with non-Christian people. A rabbi can be very wise and very helpful. Okay, a Muslim like Riaz can make you, oh wow, okay, or a Hindu like Gandhi, or some of my Buddhist friends, like a Zen Buddhist teacher I had at one time, can open up doors you didn't know were there. And it doesn't mean you give up your identity, you expand your identity. Okay? And that's what dialogue mostly does. Now, sometimes when you enter a dialogue with other people, you leave the tradition you started with altogether. You don't come back to it in a transformed way, you leave it. I know Christians who have left Christianity and have become Buddhists or Hindus or Muslims. And they're following their path. And I don't criticize them at all, because that's what dialogue can do. My sister-in-law was as much a Lutheran as Gina was at one time, but she married a Jewish man and fell in love with Judaism, not just the man, but what he, and she left and is now now Jew, and she celebrates all the holidays. You ought to see her during Passover when when she says the right words and puts this, you know,
Is it gonna be here? Okay.
and makes this motion when she blesses the food over her face. My God, that's moving, you know, and it turned around like a switch. And from me, my perspective, far out. Her relationship with God, her relationship with God is not something she determines by her beliefs. She's determined by God. And this is where God's grace is taking her. Fine, this is my Christian way of saying that. Okay?
I see Gil's hand up, and I know Jan, I think.
Yeah, well,
Sorry,
go
the
ahead.
one I was going to say was, the example you just gave, she probably has a greater understanding of humanity, humankind, as a result of that change in her life. Because having been a Christian and now being a Jew, she has a broader sense of the commonality of all faiths, even though she chose her particular path.
Oh, I think that can be true. Yeah, yeah. No, now understand, when people call me a Lubu, they're joking.
Mhm.
Because they're reading my work and hearing me talk and say, oh, he's a Lutheran Buddhist. Okay, a Lubu. But there have been Jubus. I know rabbis who practice Zen Buddhism, and they call themselves Jubus. It's not denigrating what they do. This is a humorous thing that people use, you know, and they're okay with it, you know.
I guess I'm a Luju.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see, I mean, some of us on this screen and some in the congregation and the community obviously come from many different backgrounds. And what have you kept maybe? What have you let go? What have you brought in to mold this new snowball, shall we say? And that snowball keeps changing with the weather, right? It melts and a little bit falls off and it freezes and something new is forming and coming as you experience life. New things come on to you, stick to you, and some things fall off. It would be fascinating.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. Yeah.
It'd be fascinating to see what, at some point when we can gather in person, what maybe some of those aspects of a Catholic background, a Jewish background, have been kept, interfacing with Hindu and Buddhism and Islam, that people have kept along the way, because it has meant a deeper spirituality for them, a deeper connectivity even to the divine. Because God isn't just, in one form. God is in all places, and so in all people, and how we interface with those people, we're going to encounter God differently.
You sound like a process theologian.
Jan, I think I saw your hand up earlier. Did you have something to share?
Well, I was just a couple things. This OSL,
Mhm.
you know about it? Okay, one of the things they really dislike and kind of, they don't like meditation, and they don't like this or they don't like that. So I have joined, but I'm I'm not. I like meditation. And the other thing is, way back at the beginning when you said, which religion it was, that God is everywhere. And if he is in everything, perhaps, I know some people that won't eat meat, for instance, because it's a living creature. But if he's in trees too, we shouldn't eat salads. I'm just being funny.
No, but then,
The Native Americans, before they would shoot a deer, for instance, or maybe after, they would say a prayer and thank the deer for.
Yeah, they would apologize to the animal and
Right.
yeah.
thank that life that the Creator had given to them to
Right.
be. Absolutely.
For the Muslims, for that matter.
And maybe we've forgotten to give thanks
Yeah.
in all places and in all things, because we do get stuck in a box, don't we? To see God in
Muslims apologize to the animals at Mecca
Mm.
before they slaughter them.
Okay. Well, anyway, I just wanted to end on a light note.
Well, that's a good thing to end on. But you know, religious faith is an incredibly complicated thing.
Yeah.
It really is. It's the more I've looked at different traditions, the less I know, is the feeling I get.
I had-
Because there's always something that comes up that I didn't expect to be there and think, well, how can that be? And then all of a sudden it is. And, you know, and so it's also the most fun I've ever had, except with Gina, of course. And I want to just tell you, I thought this session was incredibly good. And I want to thank you for your participation. I hope I haven't talked too much, but I wanted to get us on the right ground for next week. And next week I will be my last time, I think, as the leader, fearless leader. Rick Rouse will be coming after that, and I'll be there with him. The idea for this book was Rick Rouse, and he asked me to come along and help, and I did. So I regard him as the primary guy that should get credit for the book. He doesn't agree with that, but anyway, I wanted to help him. Huh?
So we're on to chapter 6 next week, right? Embracing differences.
Yeah. That's where we talk about what religious pluralism means.
Right.
And we have a meeting Monday night, right? The difficult discussions Monday night.
Next Monday,
No,
not tomorrow night.
22nd.
22nd.
Okay,
It's-
good.
it's with-
I can go to bed early.
It's not this, it's with Jake Pomeroy.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Very excited.
Well,
Well,
listen, thank you so much,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
and try to have a good week, Pam. Keep out of trouble.
always. Thank you.
And happy birthday coming up, Paul.
Yes, Paul.
Well, thank you.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, I'm giving up birthdays for Lent. Um,
Isn't there at a certain point you just start counting backwards? So by the time you hit 80, it's the new 40, right?
We're over that.
We're over that now. That delusion crashed on me last year. So, Pam, can you hang out a bit? I want to talk to you a little bit afterwards. Can you hang out a bit?
I can, yes.
Okay.
Bye.
The rest-
All right, bye-bye,
Got it.
everybody.